In the summer of 1944, somewhere beyond the shattered hedgerows of Normandy, an exhausted German captain stared through binoculars toward the American lines and could not understand what he was seeing. The Americans had the numbers. They had tanks. They had fuel, artillery, fresh replacements, and complete control of the skies. Any other army would have attacked immediately. Any other army would have rushed forward to finish the trapped German units before they could reorganize. But the Americans did something far more terrifying. They waited. And that silence began to scare German soldiers more than gunfire. The roads behind the German positions were already crowded with burning trucks and dead horses. Fuel was almost gone. Telephone wires had been cut by artillery. Messengers disappeared and never returned. Yet the Americans outside the pocket did not launch the giant assault many Germans expected. Instead, American artillery fired at crossroads every few hours. Fighter bombers circled overhead like vultures. Patrols moved at night. Supply routes slowly disappeared one by one. Every hour the trap became tighter. Every hour the pressure grew heavier. And somewhere inside that tightening pocket, German officers slowly realized something horrifying. The Americans were no longer fighting with speed alone. They were fighting with patience. By late World War II, the United States Army had learned a brutal lesson. Direct assaults against desperate defenders cost thousands of lives. Again and again, in places like Anzio, the Hurtgen Forest, and the mountains of Italy, American commanders discovered that charging directly into trapped German positions often created slaughterhouses. German machine guns could still tear apart attacking infantry. Mortars could still stop tanks in narrow terrain. Even when Germany was losing the war, cornered German soldiers remained extremely dangerous. So American commanders began changing the rhythm of battle itself. One of the men who understood this transformation better than most was General Omar Bradley. Quiet, calm, and far less dramatic than General George Patton, Bradley believed that unnecessary American casualties were unacceptable. He had watched too many young soldiers die in frontal assaults earlier in the war. Unlike commanders obsessed with speed and glory, Bradley increasingly favored methodical pressure. Encircle enemy forces, cut their roads, destroy their fuel, hammer them with artillery. Let exhaustion weaken them before the final blow ever came. To German officers trained in the fast-moving doctrine of blitzkrieg, this felt strange. German strategy had always emphasized momentum and shock. Strike quickly. Break through. Keep moving. But now the Germans themselves were being trapped inside shrinking pockets where time no longer worked in their favor. And the Americans understood something deadly. A trapped army often destroys itself long before the final attack begins. The best example came during the Falaise pocket in August 1944. After the Allied breakout from Normandy following Operation Cobra, German forces in France suddenly found themselves in terrible danger. American units under General Bradley smashed through weakened German lines near Saint-El, while British and Canadian forces pushed from the north. Tens of thousands of German troops began collapsing inward toward the town of Falaise. Inside the pocket were exhausted remnants of once powerful formations, including elements of the 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army. At first, many German officers believed they could still escape. German discipline remained strong in many units despite the disaster unfolding around them. Columns of tanks, horse carts, half-tracks, ambulances, and infantry began moving east through narrow roads packed with refugees and wounded soldiers. But then the Americans slowed everything down. Instead of reckless assaults into desperate German defenses, Allied artillery systematically targeted roads, bridges, crossroads, and escape routes. American aircraft attacked constantly during daylight hours. The trapped Germans could barely move. Entire convoys burned where they stood. Survivors later described roads littered with bodies, dead horses, shattered vehicles, and abandoned weapons stretching for miles. But the true horror was psychological. German soldiers inside the pocket began waking every morning, expecting the massive Allied assault that would finally crush them. Instead, they heard distant artillery. They saw fighter aircraft overhead. They watched roads disappear under shell fire. Food deliveries stopped arriving. Medical supplies vanished. Radios fell silent one after another. The Americans were squeezing slowly instead of striking fast. One German survivor later described the experience as being buried alive while still breathing. You can almost feel the tension those soldiers lived through. Every hour they waited for disaster. Every hour they listened for tank engines in the darkness. Sleep became impossible. Men smoked endlessly just to calm their nerves. Officers stopped promising rescue because no rescue was coming. The trap grew smaller every day, and the Americans outside the pocket remained patient. This patience was not accidental. It came from hard experience. Earlier in the war, American forces often attacked too quickly. In Tunisia during 1943, inexperienced U.S. units learned painful lessons against veteran German formations. At Kasserine Pass, German counterattacks exposed American weaknesses in coordination and battlefield discipline. Later, in Italy, repeated assaults against fortified German positions produced horrifying casualty lists. Mountains, rivers, mud, and machine guns turned direct attacks into nightmares. American commanders adapted. By 1944, the U.S. Army had become a completely different fighting force. Its logistics were unmatched, its artillery coordination was devastating, its air power could isolate battlefields for days at a time. Most importantly, American commanders increasingly realized they did not always need to rush. Germany was already bleeding to death. Time favored the Allies. General Matthew Ridgway understood this deeply during the final months of the war. Ridgway, commander of the 82nd Airborne Division and later WW Airborne Corps, believed constant pressure mattered more than dramatic assaults. His forces often focused on controlling roads, bridges, and terrain, while artillery and airstrikes slowly strangled trapped enemy formations. Ridgway knew exhausted German units eventually reached breaking points where surrender became more likely than resistance. And surrender terrified Nazi leadership. Adolf Hitler repeatedly ordered trapped German units to fight to the last man. No retreat, no withdrawal, no surrender. Entire divisions received impossible orders to hold positions without fuel, food, or ammunition. German officers understood the madness of these commands, but fear of execution or disgrace kept many fighting long after hope vanished. The Americans noticed this pattern quickly. If German units were fanatically ordered to hold ground, then trapping them became even more effective. A surrounded force unable to retreat would consume its own ammunition, food, fuel, and strength day after day. American patience turned Hitler's rigid orders into weapons against his own army. During the Battle of the Bulge, in December 1944, this strategy became even more visible. When German forces launched their surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest on December 16, American lines initially collapsed in several sectors. Snowstorms, confusion, and poor visibility helped German units advance deep into Belgium and Luxembourg. But once the offensive slowed, American commanders shifted into a familiar pattern. Isolate, delay, contain, exhaust. At Bastogne, surrounded American paratroopers became famous for holding against German attacks. But elsewhere across the Bulge, trapped German units faced the reverse situation. Fuel shortages became catastrophic. American aircraft returned once weather improved. Roads turned into frozen traffic jams. German columns trying to maneuver found themselves constantly under artillery fire. What terrified many German soldiers was not only American firepower, but American endurance. The Americans seemed willing to wait forever. German officers repeatedly expected aggressive counterattacks designed to achieve quick victories. Instead, American forces often tightened control methodically. Bridges disappeared under bombing raids. Road junctions fell under artillery observation. Escape corridors narrowed day by day. German troops trapped inside forests and villages found themselves slowly losing the ability to move, communicate, or even think clearly. A captured German officer near Falaise later admitted that his men feared nighttime more than combat itself. At night, engines echoed through forests. American patrols moved quietly between villages. Artillery occasionally fired single shells into crossroads just to prevent movement. Nobody slept properly. Nobody knew where the Americans would appear next. The pressure became constant. This was where American industrial power transformed patience into a battlefield weapon. The United States could sustain long operations in ways Germany no longer could. American soldiers usually received hot food, winter clothing, fresh ammunition, fuel, cigarettes, medicine, and replacement equipment even during terrible weather. German units trapped inside shrinking pockets often survived on scraps while their vehicles ran dry. A hungry soldier thinks differently from a fed soldier. An exhausted soldier makes mistakes. A trapped soldier loses hope. American commanders increasingly understood this psychological reality by late 1944 and early 1945. They did not always need dramatic breakthroughs anymore. Germany's army was cracking under endless pressure from every direction. Soviet forces were destroying German formations in the east, while Allied bombers devastated German industry from the air. Every lost truck mattered. Every destroyed fuel depot mattered. Every day mattered. The trapped Germans knew it too. One of the most chilling examples came during the Ruhr Pocket in April 1945. By then, the war in Europe was clearly nearing its end. Yet hundreds of thousands of German troops remained inside Western Germany. When American forces crossed the Rhine River and encircled the Ruhr industrial region, they trapped Army Group B under Field Marshal Walter Model. Model was one of Germany's most respected defensive commanders. Tough, intelligent, and fiercely loyal, he understood immediately how dangerous the situation had become. American forces did not need reckless assaults. The Ruhr was already isolated. Roads were cut. Bridges were gone. Fuel was nearly non-existent. German units inside the pocket became fragmented almost immediately. And again, the Americans waited. Not completely. There were still attacks, artillery strikes, patrol actions, and local battles. But the overall strategy focused on pressure instead of costly frontal assaults. American units advanced steadily while allowing hunger, confusion, exhaustion, and hopelessness to spread through the trapped German formations. Inside the pocket, discipline began collapsing. Teenage soldiers from the Hitler Youth mixed with exhausted veterans from shattered divisions. Civilians fled across roads filled with abandoned military vehicles. Communication between units failed constantly. Officers often had no idea where neighboring formations were located. Rumors spread faster than orders. Some soldiers believed Berlin had already fallen. Others believed miracle weapons would save Germany. Many simply wanted the war to end. American loudspeakers sometimes broadcast surrender instructions toward trapped German positions. Leaflets floated down from aircraft. Prisoners described good treatment in American camps. All of this increased the psychological pressure. The Americans were not simply attacking bodies anymore. They were attacking morale. General Ridgway later explained that once enemy formations became isolated, maintaining pressure mattered more than dramatic assaults. Every hour without food or rest weakened resistance. Every night without sleep damaged discipline. Every destroyed bridge trapped more vehicles. Time itself became a weapon. German survivors remembered this clearly after the war. Many described feeling hunted rather than attacked. American artillery rarely allowed true rest. Fighter aircraft constantly watched roads during daylight. Patrols appeared unexpectedly at night. Fuel disappeared first. Then ammunition. Then hope. One German medical officer trapped in the Ruhr later described hospitals filled with wounded men, begging not for medicine, but for news. They wanted to know whether rescue was coming. Usually, there was no answer, and the Americans kept closing the ring. By April 1945, some trapped German commanders began surrendering entire formations simply because continued resistance no longer made military sense. Field Marshal Model himself refused surrender publicly but privately understood the war was over. On April 21, 1945, with his pocket collapsing completely, Model committed suicide in a forest near Duisburg. Around him, more than 300,000 German soldiers eventually surrendered in the Ruhr Pocket alone. It was one of the largest mass surrenders in military history, and it had not required one giant blood-soaked assault. That realization deeply affected surviving German officers after the war. Many had spent years fighting enemies who relied on speed, shock, or overwhelming attacks. But the Americans they encountered in 1944 and 1945 increasingly fought differently. They combined massive industrial strength with patience, logistics, artillery coordination, and constant pressure. Instead of gambling everything on reckless assaults, They often let trapped German units slowly collapse under isolation. This method also protected American lives. By late war, experienced American commanders understood victory was already coming. The goal was not glory. The goal was ending the war while bringing as many American soldiers home alive as possible. If patience could destroy enemy resistance with fewer casualties, then patience became the smarter weapon. Even General George Patton, famous for aggressive attacks, understood the importance of momentum and encirclement over pointless frontal slaughter. His Third Army moved rapidly across France, not simply to attack Germans head-on, but to trap them, cut their movement, and collapse their ability to resist. Patton loved speed, but he also understood isolation could kill armies faster than direct combat. German doctrine had once relied on surrounding enemies in exactly the same way during the early years of the war. In places like Kiev and Minsk, German forces trapped massive Soviet armies inside giant pockets. Hunger, exhaustion, confusion, and hopelessness destroyed those trapped Soviet formations. But by 1944, Germany itself was suffering the same fate, and the Americans had become very good at it. There was another reason American patience felt terrifying to trapped German soldiers. It removed predictability. In traditional battles, soldiers often understood the basic rhythm: attack, defend, counterattack, pause. But trapped German units facing patient American containment operations no longer understood what came next. Sometimes there would be artillery, then silence. Sometimes tanks appeared briefly before disappearing again. Sometimes entire days passed with only aircraft overhead. The uncertainty became mentally exhausting. Every sound mattered. A truck engine at night could signal an approaching attack. A sudden silence might mean artillery preparation. A distant aircraft might become a bombing run minutes later. Men stopped sleeping deeply because death felt constantly nearby. The Americans did not always need to charge forward dramatically because the trapped Germans were already collapsing internally. By spring 1945, this pattern repeated across Western Germany again and again. Small towns became isolated pockets. Bridges vanished behind retreating forces. Fuel shortages stranded armored units. American air superiority made daylight movement nearly suicidal. German formations increasingly broke apart into disconnected groups trying simply to survive. Some still fought fanatically. Others surrendered quickly. Many existed somewhere in between, exhausted beyond reason, following orders they no longer believed in because they could not imagine any alternative. American soldiers entering captured towns often found German defenders who looked half-starved and barely awake. Prisoners sometimes carried almost no ammunition because resupply had become impossible days earlier. Horses replaced trucks because fuel no longer existed. Radios stopped working. Officers lost control of their units. The collapse did not always happen during dramatic final assaults. Often it happened quietly. A white flag appeared on a church tower. A German officer walked down a road holding surrender papers. A machine gun position simply stopped firing. A group of exhausted soldiers emerged from woods carrying wounded comrades. The Americans had learned that time could destroy armies just as effectively as bullets. And for trapped German units, that slow destruction often felt worse than direct combat itself. Because during combat, fear arrives quickly. During encirclement, fear never leaves. You wake with it, you eat with it, you march with it, you try to sleep beside it, and every hour you remain trapped, it grows stronger. That was the psychological reality many German soldiers faced during the final year of World War II. Not constant dramatic assaults, but endless pressure, endless waiting, endless uncertainty. The Americans outside the pocket had food, fuel, artillery, air support, and time. The Germans inside had shrinking supplies and fading hope. One side grew stronger every day. The other grew weaker every hour. In the end, many trapped German survivors remembered something unexpected after the war. They did not always describe the Americans as reckless attackers or unstoppable stormtroops. Instead, they remembered an enemy that seemed calm, methodical, and patient. An enemy willing to wait while isolation, exhaustion, and fear slowly did the killing. And perhaps that was the cruelest part. The Americans did not always need to destroy trapped German units immediately, because by 1944, and 1945, many of those units were already dying from inside the moment the encirclement closed.